So one thing that you'll need to know for AB Psych as far as intelligence goes is you'll need to understand how people define intelligence, and the definition of intelligence is different based on who explains intelligence. And so here are three people who are important to understanding intelligence, and there are three people who have a different opinion on how to understand intelligence. So we'll start with the first person. His name is Charles Spearman. Charles Spearman would explain intelligence as having one entity, or intelligence is one thing. So the way he would look at it is he would do a factor analysis, and he would do separate tests in different areas, and then he would look at those tests and he would take into account how an individual scored on all of those different tests, and then he would come up with one score. And he would call that one score the general intelligence, a general intelligence score, or the G. And actually, this is the way we do a lot of testing. If you think about the ACT is going to test different areas, maybe science or math or reading, and it's going to look at different components, and you might get a different score in those different areas, but ultimately you're going to come up with one composite score. And that's kind of the idea behind Charles Spearman. He's going to say that, generally that person is going to come up with one intelligence, even though there might be a little bit of difference between the different tests. He's going to come up with one composite score that he calls the G. Some people would argue that that doesn't quite make sense because some areas might be higher than others. And Charles Spearman would say, it's unlikely that there's going to be a big discrepancy. So if you take the ACT, for example, he would say, it's really unlikely that someone would score a 36 in math and a 17 in science. And so even though there might be small differences in the scores on each individual test, Charles Spearman would say there's an underlying intelligence that we can find out from putting those scores together and finding out the general intelligence, or the composite, the G. And so moving forward, though, the people that follow him, they would disagree and say that you really can't come up with one underlying score, that people really have realms in which that they are intelligent, and maybe it's just in that realm that they have strong abilities, and that we wouldn't want to average all of these together, because then it wouldn't make sense of where their strengths are. And so Howard Gardner would be one of those people who he separates it into 8 different intelligences, and he calls them the multiple intelligences. And you can see there's a little graphic right there, and those are the 8 different areas that he would say one could be good. And he would say you could be good in one area and maybe not good in another area, or score well in another area. And he would say that doesn't make someone not intelligent. You would just be high in one area, and that would be where your strength lies. And Howard Gardner he has some evidence to say that you should not average together into some composite general intelligence. And he says one reason he would say would be take into account someone with Savant Syndrome. A savant would be someone who is on the autism spectrum, who has areas where they are below average and deficits, but yet they have maybe one area where they're really exceptional and well above average. He would say if you took all of their test scores, they have one area, maybe it is logical reasoning, and that's just very, 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 very strong, but they're very low in reading, and have very poor social skills, and all their other areas are very low. If we take some composite, it's not going to make sense of what their strengths are and even what their weaknesses are. If we take this really high score and we average it with the scores that are below average, that composite score just doesn't really make sense for where their strengths and weaknesses are. And so he says that these are the 8 different areas, and you score them separately and you look at them separately. Robert Sternberg is the third person who explains intelligence, and he is along the same lines, that there are multiple ways that someone could be considered intelligent. Again, with the same idea that you wouldn't average them together. You just might be strong in one area and not in another. But I remember him in a way of thinking he is more stern, though. Robert Sternberg is more stern. He brings it down to 3 areas. The 3 areas being practical, or this element of having this social street smart idea, analytical, which would be an academic, logical, smart, and then this creative intelligence that would encompass, the arts, or would encompass problem solving and imagination, and so he brings them into more of a condensed set rather than the multiple 8 intelligences that Howard Gardner would say. Now, the way I remember them, I think Charles Spearman, I think of Charles Spearman throwing a spear and hitting a target, and that spear is going to hit one spot on that target. And so he explains intelligence as one entity, that you can take all of these components together and average it into the G, or the general intelligence, and you throw a spear, it's going to hit one spot. One intelligence. Howard Gardner, I think of multiple rows in a garden, and I think of all of these plants and vegetation that are growing at different heights and different levels, and so I think of his multiple intelligences in 8 different rows, and you're high in different areas and low in different areas. And Robert Sternberg, I just think of him being more stern than Gardner. He doesn't go all the way to Spearman's 1 intelligence, but he says there's 3. He's a little bit more stern. He brings it into a more condensed 3 intelligences. And so those are the 3 intelligence theorists that you need to know for the AP test.